Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be joining, wherever from you may be joining us. Welcome to the fifth installment of the SCA's series, United by Sustainability. Today, we will be talking about coffee and forests. So this is a topic that's very important to me personally, and we've got an excellent guest here to talk with us about it and walk us through this discussion. So my co-host Elena Ionescu and I officially welcome you here. We know that this age of having lots and lots of webinars, we try to have a little fun where we can. So we found some old photos of us, and our my colleague Bambi Semroc was kind enough to play along and included a photo that I'm told is from Indonesia in her early days working there. So this is a great time for me to welcome Bambi, who you can also see here on the camera as the Vice President of Sustainable Markets and Strategy at Conservation International. I'm your host today, Ellie Hudson from the SCA staff. I'm the Sustainability Partnerships Director after working as the Project Director for the Coffee Price Crisis Response, or the PCR initiative. My co-host, Elena Ionescu, you'll mostly be hearing from me today. We try to work on these things together. She is SCA's Chief Sustainability and Knowledge Development Officer. But just as an acknowledgement of Kim's role in this. And before I go into some introduction, I also wanted to acknowledge some of the other staff that have worked really hard to put this series together. So thank you very much for your contribution in working up to this, as well as behind the scenes in the webinar today. Julie Hausch, Sierra Hatcher, Pernilla Gard, Elena Ionescu, and Danny Pinnell. And then also thank you to my colleagues at Conservation International, in addition to Bambi, Niels Haak, and Valerie Beard, who have made this educational session happen for the SCA community, including what is a really an extraordinary amount of downloadable content that you can kind of take with you after this. So just wanted to emphasize again, if you've attended this, you'll hear this as a little bit of a repeat, but the goal of this series was certainly a place for us to come together. We know that that's desperately needed right now, and really focusing on learning opportunities, but being open to anyone in sustainability within coffee that's interested in learning more, just maybe a keen interest in sustainability, but more new to some of the in-depth discussions, all the way up to those experts in our community. And we welcome everyone and are just really glad you're here. The series itself, this is our fifth installment. This coming Tuesday will be our final episode of season 1. So we've been meeting every Tuesday at a regular time, and then Thursdays we offer 2 sessions that feature the same presenters and content. And like all of the previous sessions, we'll start today with a brief update on COVID-19 and if there are anything to acknowledge. And so this is a good time for me to direct your attention to SCA's community contributed COVID-19 updates. You can find this along with some other information in on your GoToWebinar dashboard, where it says handouts 5 of 5. You can see 4 PDFs and a Word document. The Word document is the one I'm going to point you to here. If you open this up and you can save it and take it with you, there are links to SCA's community contributed COVID-19 updates, which is just a very large amount of information. Most of these resources are in English, but we do welcome submissions and resources in any language. And if you're looking for some support or just wanting to connect with people in your region within coffee, or there's all kinds of resources looking to help, I would urge you to check it out. So we also have, as you can see, 4 other downloadable PDFs here. These were contributed by the team at CI that you'll hear us kind of refer to some of these materials. And then in the Word document, there are also some links to some things that we are going to talk about. So I wanted to draw your attention, obviously, to next Tuesday's webinar, which is at 8. That's the final installment of season 1 of United by Sustainability. We'll be talking about data and economics with our colleagues at the ICO. It's going to be incredible. We're really excited about that. And then also, I wanted to invite you to join us on Wednesday for a coffee break that's being hosted by Conservation International. So you'll hear about that a little later. Just kind of thinking now, what were some of the questions we asked ourselves when we wanted to put this together? So this is, I'm not going to go through these line by line, but you can kind of see the story. And we're starting with what is deforestation and ending with how can we drive this agenda forward. It's a lot to cover in a 1-hour webinar, but we think that the case is really strong for why the coffee community can, should, and does care about forests and what it can do to help us mitigate some of the sustainability crises we are facing. So we had some feedback recently that it wasn't made clear enough whether participants were allowed to make comments or ask questions. So I do want to take a second to make sure that we do make that clear. We hope this can be as interactive as you want it to be as our community here. There's a couple different ways that you can interact. You can raise your hand, and we're going to hold all the Q&A questions and comments and answers until the very end, but you can submit a question at any time. Our custom is to read your first name along with the question. If you do not want us to do that, please just mention it when you type the question. And we will be launching a couple of interactive polls. These are confidential, so it doesn't display who said what, but it will display as a percentage of the audience. So this is kind of a neat way, not just to make your voice heard, but also to see what your colleagues on the webinar here, your fellow coffee professionals and sustainability professionals, you know, who's here with you. So it's kind of a neat way to see that and people's differing opinions and experiences. So just to emphasize, there's a couple of different ways to interact, and our Q&A will be toward the end. So with that, I'm going to launch our first 2 polls, starting with we are interested in what type of coffee activity are you involved in? All right, we've got 81%, 83%. I'm going to leave it open for just another 10 seconds or so. If you are not involved in any of these things, please just don't vote. I am limited to 5 choices, and so I didn't want to try and have none of the above, which would take one of the other ones away. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close this. All right, as you can see, we've got a mix of different types of professionals here, brewing and roasting being the overwhelming majority. We did a webinar at 3 a.m. Pacific time with the same group of people that you see here. I'm in Eastern time, and so is Bambi, so that's 6 a.m. for us, not quite as horrifying as our colleagues on the West Coast. But this skewed more towards importing and exporting this morning. So just kind of interesting to see the different audiences. All right, now shifting gears, we want to know what you think about coffee and deforestation. All right, as this comes in, we've got about 70% of the votes in. This time you do have a chance to say you're not sure, which several people have. 81%. Give it about another 10 seconds. (83, 85%). Okay. Little bit of a mix. This is a good time for me to ask Bambi, what do you think? What is this telling you?
It's interesting because it's quite similar to what we saw this morning in terms of people understanding that coffee can drive deforestation. It currently is, it may continue into the future, and it's not just the palm oil, soy, and other crops that are driving it. So I think it's confirming what we know to be real in the coffee sector and what we want to talk about today.
Great. I think you should be able to share your screen now. Oh, I have to hide the poll.
Turn off the poll.
Yeah.
Okay. 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 Well, thank you, Ellie and Kimalena and the whole SCA team for this opportunity to be here with you today. And I also want to thank Niels and Valerie from my own team for helping prepare all of this. So you might hear my voice, but there's a lot of voices behind what you're going to see today. And we just are really appreciative of this chance to share some of our latest thinking with you in terms of, I sit within Conservation International. I've been there for over 18 years working on coffee. So we work on coffee because it is in and around the places that we are trying to conserve for the benefit of nature. We realize that in order to conserve any place, we need to show that nature has a real value and enables people to thrive. And so at Conservation International, we believe that people do need nature to thrive. And so when we think about coffee, we also know that people need coffee to thrive. And in more ways than one, we know that people need coffee in order to wake up every morning. And when we were waking up at 6 a.m., I think people had a lot of coffee already flowing into their systems, hopefully. And but we also need to think about the role that coffee plays in economic development and the prosperity and livelihoods of the people who are actually producing the coffee itself. And we know that with the COVID-19 crisis, a lot of that is under threat right now in terms of, what's happening to coffee communities, what's happening to the sector as a whole, and really how fragile our ecosystem and our business systems actually are. And I think that, it might seem strange to be talking about forests and coffee at a time when there's such a public health scare. But, these public health issues are actually derived from the interactions between people and nature. And so if we provide enough space for nature, we believe that we can more quickly isolate these types of events in the future. And so it really is quite relevant to the crises that we're facing today. And we send everybody all the best and for your health and well-being during this time. So, it's quite challenging. So with that, I'll get started. And I think that through the poll that Ellie just did, we know that, most of you understand the answer to this question in terms of does coffee drive deforestation. We did a session last year at Expo, really starting to think about this in terms of does the coffee sector need to have a bigger kind of no deforestation commitment. And the question that, we're always raising is like, do people believe that coffee drives deforestation? Does the coffee sector really need to worry about this at this point in time? And we think about this in the grand scheme of agriculture and big threats to forests. I mean, coffee deforestation tends not to look like this. This is not a picture of coffee driving deforestation. This is a picture of usually what palm oil driven deforestation looks like, or soy, or timber harvesting for pulp or wood. It can also be clearing for beef, pasture, and cattle. So, this is like the type of scars on the land that we're able to usually depict from satellite imagery from space. And we're not usually picking up coffee-related deforestation in the same way. It's not these huge scars on the landscape where you're just removing everything in its site and replanting it with something else. But that said, one of the things that when Kimalena and I were in Mombasa recently for the African Fine Coffee Association meeting, she mentioned this report that had come out where even though we don't tend to think of coffee as a major driver of deforestation like the others are, it's starting to get some kind of scrutiny in terms of increased scrutiny in terms of the land use that is under coffee production. And this was one study that looked at land use per kilogram of food product and how intensive different food products are. And so you see lamb and beef and cheese, and those should come as no surprise. But, when you look at like number 6, it's coffee. And that was a little bit more surprising to some of us who saw this report and trying to understand, okay, why is coffee quite so high? Is it because they didn't include other commodities, or, you know, is there something we really need to be thinking about? And so I think it's also, when you think about the need for food, is coffee a necessity? I think some people would say yes, but in the grand scheme of things, if you're trying to meet global demand for protein and nutrition, coffee's not in there. So this is going to come up more and more. And in terms of the amount of land use, you tend to also think about the climate side of things as well. And I'll talk more about that later on in the session. So yeah, I showed you that picture of what deforestation tends to look like from some of the other industries. And this is really what coffee-driven deforestation can look like. This is a picture of the Batangaras National Park in North Sumatra in Indonesia. In this case, you see some quite large stumps. So this is an area that was cleared, timber was taken out, coffee is now put in. So any type of vegetation that you see sprouting from the devastation is actually coffee. But you still see some trees remaining, you see large stumps, and you see a lot of vegetation around the area, and it's not a huge swath of land that has been cleared. And this tends to be what we see where we work as a conservation organization working in about 25 countries around the world. When we work on coffee, and we work on coffee in and around protected areas or important sites for conservation, this tends to be what we're looking at. It's these smallish areas that are being cleared for increased coffee production. And sometimes it's quite illegal. So this is illegal clearing into protected areas. And what we see is the pressure for this type of expansion of the coffee footprint is actually just increasing. It's mounting, especially as we did a study earlier, a couple of years ago, looking at how much coffee do we really need to meet future demand. And what we found is we need to potentially double or even triple coffee production to meet this demand. And that means about 4 to 14 million more tons of coffee per year, especially if, in that higher end of that spectrum is especially if China and India continue their thirst for coffee and that transition to more coffee consumption. If we need that much more coffee, that means we might need 20 to 30 million more hectares of land to produce that, if we're not able to produce that on the existing coffee farms. And so when we think about where that land might come from, we start to see the impacts of climate change on the suitability of coffee production and the area that's suitable for coffee production. So even though we might lose about 50% of the suitable area based on what the International Center for Tropical Agriculture has said, we can look at, okay, where are the areas that are becoming more suitable for coffee or remaining suitable for coffee into the future? And unfortunately, a lot of those are natural forested areas. And so about 60% of the area that is suitable to grow coffee in 2050 is actually currently forested. And only about 20% of that is under any sort of form of protection, which means that about 40% of that forest area is up for grabs. And that's really what we're concerned about. How do we protect the areas that are still under protection, but how do we make sure that we're not losing these last remaining intact areas, especially for Arabica production? I think this is something that's quite pertinent to the specialty industry. It's the Arabicas that are going to move up into those and come up against the forest more quickly than the Robustas or lower quality coffees that are in those lower altitudes, because usually those lower altitudes have already been cleared and the higher altitudes are either too steep, too inaccessible in the past, and it just didn't make sense to try and move up the mountainside to grow coffee. And those things change over time as the economics change of these systems. And so when we look at this, we've done a lot of analyses over the past 6 months within Conservation International to look at these, the situation for different countries. And one example of an area that, flashed up for us, and, a prime case of what happens when suitability declines significantly for a coffee producing country of the existing land, and what land is then available for future coffee production. And so in El Salvador, the situation is that there may actually be insufficient non-forest area that's suitable for coffee to even maintain current production volumes into the future. And so what you see in the light brown here is a total suitable area today and in 2050. And then that is made up of the dark brown and the green. It's a total of those two. And what the dark brown represents is the suitable area that is not forested, and the green area is the suitable area that is forested. And so, like this shows, if you see a 70% decline in the total area, the total suitable non-forest area, you're going to have to make that up through either tremendous productivity increases on the remaining suitable land, or you're going to have to expand into some of those forested areas. And that's the threat that is really ahead of us for El Salvador, but for a number of other regions as well. And so we were fortunate just last year to work together with the Specialty Coffee Association, with Coffee and Climate, IDH, and the Global Coffee Platform to publish this report called Brewing Up Climate Change, Climate Resilience in the Coffee Sector. And the idea was to try and identify what are the key stresses that climate change is placing on coffee. And you'll see here that that loss of suitable land was one that was really highlighted. And the others here in terms of water stress, poor flowering and cherry development, vulnerability to smallholders and women and pest and disease outbreaks are things that we have to be addressing on farms to be able to increase production on those existing lands so we don't have to expand further into that 60% that is forested. So we have to be able to get this right. And this report we recommend that you download. It has a lot of information about what interventions we can put in place to really address this crisis that is brewing in the coffee sector. And so that's kind of the bad news, right? That's the threat, that's the risk that we face within the coffee sector. And what we've been working on over the past several months is trying to think about, well, what's the good news in all of this? What's our potential in terms of addressing these deforestation issues in the coffee sector? And then by doing so, how do we help tackle the tremendous crisis that we're facing in terms of climate change? So how can we make coffee part of the solution and not just sometimes as what agriculture is seen more broadly as part of the problem? And so at Conservation International, we are so fortunate to have a team of scientists, really cutting edge scientists who work alongside of us. And one of our scientists, working with a number of other organizations, led a paper that was just released a week and a half ago, looking at places that have what we are considering irrecoverable carbon. These are places where the soil and the vegetation on these lands house carbon that, if lost, could not be restored in an amount of time that would enable us to remain on track to 1.5 to 2 degrees of global climate change. And so what you see here is a darker purple represents the areas that harbor more carbon that is irrecoverable, and the lighter purples still have a lot of carbon, but less than those that are in the darker. And what you also see here is if you were to overlay a coffee belt map over this, those dark purple areas for the most part are also coffee producing regions. So this is where there's a lot of potential. There's the forests that are under threat harbor a lot of carbon, and the coffee can also harbor a lot of carbon if we do the coffee correctly. And so at Conservation International, we're also been working quite heavily to identify how much nature do we need to secure a stable climate into the future. And so we've started to define what our planetary need for forests, for nature is by 2030. And what the science shows is that we actually need to get out of nature about a third of the emissions avoidance or emissions reductions and the carbon storage that the planet needs in order to stay on track to less than 1.5 degrees of global warming. And of course, we still need to be doing everything to limit our fossil fuel and other emissions from the activities that our economies do. But we also need to be making sure that we are protecting ecosystems and restoring ecosystems so that we can get about 10 gigatons per year from nature. And that's through restoration of nature, reforestation. It can be through agroforestry systems, and it's also from pure conservation in terms of how do we protect the areas that are still under forest. And so when we look at that in relationship to coffee, we try to figure out, okay, how much of that 10 million or 10 gigatons could come from the coffee sector? And so what we've done is try to estimate how much carbon could we get from the coffee sector in that same amount of time. And so our estimates have really shown that the carbon benefit from sustainable coffee could be upwards of 1.67 to 3.4 gigatons. And then the rest of the slide really shows you how we back into that number. So if coffee is currently grown on 10 million hectares globally, and we need to double or potentially triple production to meet global demand, like I mentioned earlier, that could mean about 10 to 20 million hectares that we could need if we're not able to increase production on the existing lands. And if we were to lose that amount of land on tropical forests, we would actually, that would result in that 1.65 to 3.3 gigatons of carbon emissions. But on the other side, so the other side is that we can actually look at how much of the coffee area, and right now it's about 41%, it has no shade cover. And we know that shade and other agroforestry interventions could be important adaptation strategies for farmers. And it's not just shade, it's windbreaks, it's other adaptation mechanisms that involve tree planting. And doing that in a way that's responsible in terms of not just planting trees, but trying to optimize for production and income at the farm level. And so we know that we estimated by increasing tree cover on that 4.1 million hectares, we could store potentially an additional 25 to 148 million tons of carbon, depending on the type of system applied. So if you have a high biodiversity, multi-strata agroforestry system, you get higher levels of carbon. If you have single species shade trees that are very sparse in the coffee farm, you get the lower number. And what we also know about these types of interventions is that these actually help farmers withstand climate market shocks that they're currently facing by helping diversify income sources and driving profitability. And in that diversifying income sources, it's not just about what other income comes from the trees, but also thinking about how do we remunerate or compensate farmers or pay farmers not just for the coffee and other agricultural products coming out, but also for the carbon through the leveraging of carbon markets and carbon payments. And so a lot of times, the carbon scientists speak a completely different language than what you and I might speak. And so trying to put all this in perspective when we talk about gigatons, like what does it actually mean? And what it comes down to is like 1 gigaton is actually the weight of about 100 million African elephants. It's a huge contribution that coffee could be making because it's even more than 1 gigaton. And it's always nice to see some of the wildlife that we're trying to conserve up here in some of our presentations as well. So what we've been trying to do from that is like, okay, if that's a big, ambitious opportunity, how do we align on what we do where? How do we align on the priorities? And how do we start to set some of those in motion? And so we've looked at this in 5 different ways, and I'll walk you through those quite quickly. But we see areas where there's high potential for coffee-driven deforestation today. And this is because these countries currently have over 30 million hectares of primary forest remaining. And we see growth in the coffee area harvested over the past 5 years, and that over 10 million hectares of forest are suitable for coffee. And so countries like Indonesia, Peru, Colombia start to pop up, and some of those are surprising sometimes because you don't necessarily think of Colombia as an area where you see tremendous coffee expansion into forests, but it's something that we need to start paying more attention to and understand better. We also looked at the high potential for coffee-driven deforestation in the future. And while some of these countries are the same, some of them are quite different. So we see that El Salvador case, we start to see Papua New Guinea and Cote d'Ivoire pop up because these are places where there may be insufficient non-suitable forest area to maintain current production levels. And over 50% of the suitable area would need to be in use by 2050 to maintain those production levels for countries like El Salvador, Cote d'Ivoire. In the other cases, it's actually the fact that there's still growth in the area harvested and over 10 million hectares of unprotected suitable forest is in play. And so we need to figure out ways of securing that and protecting that against future coffee expansion. On the more positive side, in terms of what can coffee do to extend forest, there is high potential for reforestation within coffee production systems in some places that have low levels of shade production high decline in suitable land for coffee, and some potential for coffee-driven reforestation just by transitioning from full sun to very low shade production systems. And so countries like Brazil, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Mexico all pop up there. And then so in other places, we know that there's a tremendous need for renovation, rehabilitation investments, and pulling out old, diseased, dying coffee trees and replanting them with more productive ones, especially on smallholder lands. And so we did a study with USAID in Baalberg a few years back, looking at what that need was, and they were able to estimate how much land spared you would get from these types of investments. And so these are the countries where we see the most need and the most potential for increased productivity on a per hectare basis, and that potential land sparing in terms of not having to encroach into forest areas. And finally, the fifth area that we've been looking at is these areas where we see potential for significant tree cover loss due to lost coffee areas. So we may not always think of coffee areas as forests, but coffee is a tree crop that grows under other trees. And so when we start to think about if these areas are becoming less suitable for coffee, what are they going to turn into? What are the alternatives? And if it's not another tree crop, we lose a tremendous amount of biodiversity, but also we could be losing a tremendous amount of carbon as well. And so countries like Brazil, El Salvador, Mexico, and Tanzania start to come into the picture here because we already see a decline in the area harvested and a significant decline predicted in terms of the suitable area into the future. So these are some of the ways that we've been trying to think about, okay, which types of interventions do we need to put in place based on the situation at hand? And it's also interesting to note that it's, different countries are popping, the same country can pop up in multiple of these classifications. And so what we're really trying to think about within Conservation International is this idea that we know that climate change is predicted to significantly disrupt the coffee sector. And, we want to do everything in our power to fight against that. But we also, I think it's time for the coffee sector to realize that it can lead in disrupting climate change by really doubling down on doing the right things to conserve forests, to increase forest cover, and to sustain coffee production in these landscapes. And it's quite urgent to do this now. And so we really need to be scaling up a lot of the work that is going on and getting this to be a more sector-wide investment and initiative. But with that said, it's like, okay, we can do all the science and priority setting in the world, but we have to be able to show that we can actually solve for this. And so I'm going to talk through one example of how Conservation International is working with partners in the San Martin region of Peru to really address some of these issues. So this is a picture of course, of coffee plant blooming, and in the background you see tremendous amounts of primary forest in the background. So the Alto-Mayo protected forest, this is a protected area. It's really got a tremendous amount of species like orchids and birds, but we don't just think about it in the sense of what it does for nature. We think about it also in terms of a place where people are living and trying to eke out an economic existence. And about, over 250,000 people live in this particular basin. And the basin consists of what you see in the dark green as the protected forest, what you see in light green is the broader basin, and what you see in the orange are these native communities and native indigenous populations that are settled, that have been there for centuries. And this also includes 14 watersheds, and so these forests are really important for providing communities with a long-term supply of fresh water for their livelihoods as well. So in terms of protecting these areas, there are tremendous amounts of co-benefits that we get from these initiatives. And what we found when we started exploring this particular protected area was there were high rates of deforestation, and we did further analysis to figure out what was driving that deforestation. And we found that 40% of the deforestation that we were seeing was driven by coffee. And this, again, it looks quite similar to what I showed you in Indonesia. You have much smaller stumps, so younger trees potentially getting cleared, but coffee going into small patches of land. And what was happening here is we saw basically what I would consider slash and burn coffee taking place. Farmers going in, clearing land, planting coffee, harvesting it for 7 years, not really managing it for a long-term sustained supply. And so when the productivity crashed, they abandoned this and moved on and cleared a new patch of land. And so what we needed to go in and do is figure out how could we stop that cycle? What would it take? What conversations and negotiations could we put in place with these farmers to really address the issue? And so this is what that productivity curve actually looked like when we went in. And through a series of different interventions and investments that I'll talk through in the next slide, we were able to actually not just stabilize production, but to actually increase it over time on a per hectare basis. And so what we went in and did, together with a tremendous amount of partnerships with local agronomy organizations, local partners, is to think about what's that package of technical assistance that we could provide in terms of fertilizers, pest control, renovation, training, demonstration plots. We also went in and helped farmers organize. They were not in any sort of cooperative, didn't have any real access to markets in terms of how to trade their coffee. And so a tremendous amount of investment goes in to try and correct this type of situation. And what we do is we use what we call conservation agreements as a mechanism for having the negotiation with the farmers and the communities to say, okay, in return for these types of interventions, would you be willing to stop this type of pattern? Would you be willing to actually be stewards of nature as opposed to what you've been traditionally doing? And the resounding response has been yes, and we've signed conservation agreements with thousands of farmers at this time. And so we need these types of investments. We need to be able to identify those types of areas more broadly, and we need these types of interventions and investments to be going into solving for these places that we're seeing coffee drive deforestation. And so what we feel like the sector needs to do is to commit to a climate resilient sector that supports farmers, sustains coffee, and conserves forests. We need to be designing and implementing these collective action plans for sustainable economic development at the community and landscape levels. These things do not work if the farmers can't see an economic benefit through these activities. Now we need to be monitoring changes in coffee and forest and carbon over time so that we can actually get a better understanding of where these opportunities lie and how to leverage carbon finance to support the long-term provision of services to these types of communities. And that's exactly what we're doing in the Alto Mayo. It's a REDD+ carbon project where you can actually purchase carbon credits that support the long-term service provision to those communities. And so that's something that's very important to us in terms of trying to think about how do we sustain these interventions into the long term. And in some cases, the carbon market can help us with that long-term financing. And so we have these types of examples from Conservation International, from a lot of other organizations working on the ground with coffee producers in some of these sometimes remote areas. But it's not quite enough to be addressing this at the scale we need to, given the situation that is looming ahead of us for 2050. And so in partnership with Starbucks, the SCA, and about 17 other organizations, we launched the Sustainable Coffee Challenge back in December of 2015 at the Paris climate meetings. And the idea behind this was that we wanted to spark a movement within the coffee sector to make coffee the world's first sustainable agricultural product. And today we're so proud to have more than 145 partners currently working with us to drive this agenda forward. These partners represent everything from the private sector to civil society and associations to the public sector, government agencies, and producing and consuming countries. And so if you're interested in learning more, please simply email us at sec@conservation.org. And we're happy to have a conversation about how you can also get involved in this. And talk a little bit more about what this looks like and what we do to try and drive these types of programs at scale. These are some of the partners that you'll see in here, and they range from, small boutique specialty coffee companies to large retailers and roasters and grocery markets, really trying to make sure that everybody does have a role to play and they understand what their role could be in driving this type of action forward. And so what we've spent the past 5 years on is really trying to do 3 key things. One was to increase transparency of sustainability commitments across the sector. So we have a commitments hub where we ask our partners to go in, state their commitment, and maybe it's multiple commitments to sustainability, and report annually on their progress. And we've started to take stock of that on an annual basis and publish what you see on the left-hand side is the Commitments Hub report. And I believe there's a download link to that report in the downloads here. We also spent about almost 2 years trying to align the sector around a common sustainability framework. This was done in partnership with the Global Coffee Platform and a number of other organizations. Really trying to say, what are we talking about when we talk about sustainability? What are the intervention areas that we tend to invest in? And how do they really all work together to drive us towards a sustainable coffee sector? And then the last thing that, the most recent thing that we've been doing is really trying to coalesce or partner around addressing some critical issues facing the coffee sector. And so we have what we call collective action networks that we facilitate, and some are facilitated by partner organizations like Rainforest Alliance or Fair Trade USA, to really try and understand what the issue is and how we collectively can address it. And so we have one of these networks meets around coffee and forest. It's been focused primarily on how do we understand where deforestation and reforestation opportunities might be, and how we map and monitor that. And we're transitioning it to be more of like the centerpiece for where we have this conversation about coffee, forests, and carbon and climate change within the Sustainable Coffee Challenge. And each of those networks has created a wide range of tools and resources to help partners figure out what their commitment could be and then how to work with others to address these programs. And I'd say within that mapping and monitoring of coffee and forests, we've been fortunate enough to have some support from the Walmart Foundation to actually work with some of the Sustainable Coffee Challenge partners to map coffee and forests in Indonesia and Colombia so that we actually can start to pinpoint some of these places where we would want to be driving more investment into the future. We know we need to do that for many more countries, but that at least gives us a starting point to get a methodology where we can do this into the future. In March, early March, before all the COVID situation hit, or as it was starting to heat up here in the United States, we were able to sneak in our annual all-partner meeting of the Sustainable Coffee Challenge and to really discuss a 5-year strategy for the challenge that starts to pivot us towards some long-term 2050 goals in the first 5-year plan towards those goals, where we start to incorporate this idea of nature and coffee as a climate solution. And so having these long-term 2050 goals around doubling smallholder productivity and living income for farmers and workers, transitioning to sustainable sourcing, and then on the piece that's more relevant for this webinar is this idea of how do we conserve nature, these targets around restoration of 2.5 million hectares and conserving 5 million hectares of forest. And in doing this, we can secure about 1.65 to 3.3 gigatons of carbon and be part of that long-term climate solution. And so when we think about how do we start on this trajectory, we needed to also draft some 2025 targets. And you can see these here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but trying to build out a plan for how we restore, hectares and conserve hectares, and how do we improve production on existing farms, so that when doing so, we can advance towards living incomes and we can secure about 100 million tons of carbon through those conservation efforts. And people always ask us, well, how did you get to 100 million tons? And so there's a science to it and there's an art to it. And so these are based on our best estimates of we can get 19 million metric tons via new trees on farms, and about 75 million metric tons through avoiding expansion by increasing production on existing farms through renovation, rehabilitation, technical assistance types of interventions. And so if you add those two numbers up, you get to about 94 million tons of carbon. And then, of course, we always like big round numbers. And so we think we can be a little more ambitious than that and round up to about 100 million. So that's really where those numbers come from. And what we're doing now is a series of webinars to We wanted to do this in Portland as part of the SCA Expo, but now we're doing this all virtually to have stakeholder sessions to really talk through what those target numbers should be. Do we have them right? Do they need to be expanded? Do they need to be condensed? And how do we really rally the sector around those so that we can actually make sure that coffee is a positive force for conservation and for climate? And so we also have heard from stakeholders that they want us to suggest what potential forest and climate commitments could be that they could put into the commitments hub. And so things could be around reforestation, avoided deforestation, enhanced agroforestry systems. And this other idea of like in the supply chain, we can think about those offsetting of unavoidable emissions through forest conservation, forest restoration types of programs, like what I just showed you in the Alto Mayo. That counts as forest conservation. And so there are offsets available through that. So if you're trying to understand what your unavoidable emissions might be once you've reduced your energy use and transitioned to renewable energy, you have some residual emissions that you may need to offset, and we suggest that companies offset that or organizations offset those emissions through investments in nature. And so with that, I'm going to just turn quickly to how you can get involved in all of this tremendous work that's going on in the sector and be part of this great movement that we're really trying to spearhead so that we can be part of the solution. So we welcome all actors from across the coffee sector to join us. And we do ask that partners set and share and track individual commitments towards the global targets, that they contribute and are open to collective action against those targets, and that they provide strategic and financial support to make sure that this can all keep running into the future. We will be having the first of our, it'll be like a 5-session coffee breaks or strategic sessions about these different goals, these 5-year goals and targets. The first one will be on Earth Day next week on April 22nd. And we invite everybody to join us for a discussion of a deeper dive into what I shared with you in terms of these potential long-term 2050 goals and targets and the first 5-year goals and targets as well. And you can register by scanning the QR code here. We can also put this as the link to register into the chat function as well. And then finally, you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter. This comes out once a month at the beginning of the month. You can sign up, and this keeps you abreast of everything that we're doing in the Sustainable Coffee Challenge. You can also go to sustainedcoffee.org and learn more about all the resources that Ellie's been putting into the resource section in terms of the downloads. And finally, we know that we're all in this situation together, and many of us have children that we're trying to homeschool at the same time as keeping the sustainable coffee movement moving forward. And so one of the things we kicked off almost over a month ago was this sustainable coffee art contest. And so it's going to actually end on Friday, but if you're interested in having something that occupies your children for maybe an hour while you do a conference call or attend a webinar, this is something you can participate in. Just asking kids to think about what coffee means to them and create a coffee related drawing or a piece of art. Take a picture of it, send it to us, and on Friday we will pick our favorites, announce winners, and send out some prizes. I know that my son, who does not like doing art, he was actually intrigued by this, and this did help me for about an hour. So this is actually very helpful for some of us trying to balance these responsibilities that we now have. So with that, I just want to say thank you again for joining us today. Turn it back to Ellie, and very open to answering questions that anybody may have. Thank you again.
Thank you, Bambi. I've seen some questions come in already. And before we get to that, now that we've kind of introduced the Sustainable Coffee Challenge, we are wondering, did you know about it already, or how involved are you or your company in the Sustainable Coffee Challenge? Right, we got about almost 70%. 77%. All right, I'm going to give it about another 10 seconds, and then we'll share the results with you. So a mix between learning about it for the first time today, which is great, to plenty of representation from those who have already made a commitment in the Commitments Hub or involved in an action network attending Sustainable Coffee Challenge meetings, to the tangentially involved or not sure. So I'll do one question. So this is a question that came in from Julie. Are the countries in the priorities slide limited to countries where Conservation International is present in, or does this represent a broader view of every country where coffee production exists?
This definitely is a great question, and thank you for that one. It definitely represents a much broader view than where we have offices or interventions. We probably have offices, maybe like 3 of that entire list. And what we did is we looked at about 20 different countries to do this work, and some of that was based on the availability of data. And we know that coffee is produced far beyond those 20. But we did look at the top producing countries, and then the countries where there's a tremendous amount of forest at risk.
Thank you. And this is probably a quick question from Frank. Can the coffee art contest submission be submitted anytime tomorrow, April 17th?
Of course, yes.
Okay, we have another question from Samantha. How can we create transparency with roasters on where they source their beans?
That's a great question in terms of, getting to a point where that's not proprietary information. In terms of, I think more companies are open to sharing a little bit more about where they're sourcing, but there is, some business proprietary sensitive information in terms of sharing that as well. I think that has to be part of, we do have a sourcing action network within the Sustainable Coffee Challenge that is trying to create more transparency in terms of driving sourcing commitments, and really trying to leverage things like transparent trade and those types of initiatives to try and get more transparency, not just in terms of where people are sourcing, but I think it's also about the economics of the trade in terms of how much is flowing back to the farmer. In terms of that transparency, I think is equally important. And I think that we need to be better at understanding both of those things, understand where the opportunities for co-investment and across multiple companies, but then also trying to understand, just like we've done here on forests and coffee, we need to do a commensurate study of like, where do we see a lack of transparency and high levels of poverty and income issues from coffee for certain places, and that's through like the living income dialogue that I knew that Ellie and Kimmelina are involved in with the Sustainable Food Lab and others. So I think that we need equivalent priority setting processes for that side of the equation as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was going to chime in on that. I think one of I'll plug our recorded webinars from the living income from a couple weeks ago, and these are available at sca.coffee/news, any of the recordings. And we had slightly different participation from the two, but the content was very similar. And one of the things that the living income movement has identified are what I'll just summarize and say the 4 archetypes. So these are 4 different ways that coffee is bought by coffee companies. And so I think that this helps us organize a little bit around what we might do with that information. So I would just direct you towards those recordings and learn a little bit more about that, because I think that is a great way to analyze that. And then also, just in case there are any, if there are members of the webinar here, attendees who wanted to comment on that, I think that that's something that just hit the raise hand button and I'll be happy to unmute you if there's anybody that has something that they wanted to add from our attendees. We have a question from Esteban. Bambi, do you think the current best agronomical practices recommended on the main certifications are enough to get us to that 100 gigatons of carbon, or will we need to change recommendations?
It's a great question. I think that when I look at what's in the recommended, certification, verification, best agronomic practices, I think that the agronomic practices are good for coffee, right? We know that they're good for coffee. I think a lot of, if you wanted to maximize production, I think that a lot of the optional requirements these days are really around the forest conservation, the agroforestry practices. I think that those all need to be looked at with a fresh set of eyes in terms of which of these are going to be most effective or relevant given the climate scenarios that we're facing for production in these places. I think that there's a new lens that we need to look at these with in terms of, are these places still highly suitable for coffee production? If so, these are probably still the right agronomic practices. If they're becoming less suitable, then I think we have to think about diversification, maybe potentially more shade, potentially different agronomic practices, and be open to experimenting more with those. And I think that there's some studies so when we see, Brazil pop up as one where, you have tremendous amounts of low shade systems, we don't expect that to transition to shade overnight. That's not going to happen. But there are studies showing that might actually need to happen to sustain production in Brazil, given how hot and dry it's likely to get in the coming years. And so I just feel like I'm not sure we know enough right now if those are actually the right agronomic practices all the time. And I think it's really has to be done on a landscape by landscape or case by case basis of what's the farmer trying to do in terms of optimizing production for, or what are they trying to achieve through their farm? And then trying to figure out what's the right balance of interventions to be able to help the farmer succeed in what they're trying to do. And that could be trying to maximize coffee production, but that could be also trying to diversify a bit more and make sure that they can sustain price crises, COVID crises, climate incidents, storms, droughts, etc. So I think that we just have to be mindful of what we're promoting based on a really in-depth conversation with the farmers themselves.
We are being asked, I put the links up, but could you put the QR code back up for the meeting on Earth Day?
Sure. I'm going to share my screen again and pull this up.
And then I added links if you want to take a look at your chat window too. It might look like an announcement, I guess. Give this another 10 seconds or so, and then we do have one final poll. But I can't do that at the same time that this is up. So give everybody a chance to grab their phone, download a QR reader from the App Store. All right, so as you may have noticed, or I might have even mentioned it at the beginning, we at the SCA are trying to offer these webinars at different times of the day in order to accommodate our global community. So we are just asking our attendees to let us know where you are calling in from, so that we can just kind of see if it's working or if we need to make some adjustments. So this is just for our own purposes of planning forward when we bring this series back for season 2, as well as other SCA webinars that many of us on the staff are involved in. Even within the Sustainable Coffee Challenge, we've talked about trying to schedule call times and meetings that aren't central to, most often North America. So I think that this is we're trying to lead by example, but we just want to know where you all are calling from. Okay, so we've got 82% have voted, 84, 86. We'll give it another 10 seconds or so. All right. Oops, one little vote just snuck in there. Okay. So this is definitely, I think we could be safe in saying this is a very North America centric time to produce this webinar, as opposed to this morning where 65% of our attendees were in Europe and another 20-ish% were calling from Asia, Asia Pacific, or Australia, New Zealand. We grouped those together because of the time zone similarity, just as a mention. Okay, well, it's that has taken us to the top of the hour. So I want to just take a second to thank my colleagues at the SCA and Conservation International. Thank you, Bambi, for taking us through this. And above all else, thank you, attendees, for joining us and giving us your attention and great questions during this hour. So wish you the rest of a great rest of your Thursday, rest of your week, rest of your month. Stay healthy, and hopefully we'll see you on Tuesday for the final installment of this series.
Thanks so much.